Okay, looks like we have a good amount in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly McGurr. I'm the Events and Programs Manager for Traverse Connect. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. We do highly encourage you to ask any and all questions that you might have. There is a Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free, anything at all that you have questions about, have comments about, please feel free to ask that there. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. Ryan will be pausing a few times to help get any of those answered, as well as at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking questions then too. So on that note, I would now like to turn it over to Kirsty Seeloff. Kirsty, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, Molly. Well, thank you everyone for joining our CARES Act and Recovery webinar today, presented by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. My name is Kirsty Seeloff, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for Traverse Connect and also the Northern Michigan Chamber Alliance. Our alliance is a coalition of chambers and economic development organizations from all across Northern Michigan, including Alpena, Benzie, Cadillac, Charlevoix, Gaylord, Petoskey, Traverse City, Manistee, Marquette, Elk Rapids, Harbor Springs, Boyne, East Jordan, Sheboygan, Sioux area, and Leelanau. So we're very excited to welcome Ryan Gleason, who is a manager of congressional and public affairs with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Great Lakes region that encompasses Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thanks, Molly, for having me on this afternoon. It's good to be with everyone. I wish I was with everyone under better circumstances. But so today I'm going to go over the CARES Act and some major provisions. Obviously, I'm sure we all heard about updates that have happened recently. And then what returning to work is going to look like. We at the U.S. Chamber 2 weeks ago put together a path forward initiative about what returning to work will look like as we move forward. Okay. Okay, so just to kind of give you a little bit of the idea of scale about the Federal CARES Act that passed a number of Fridays ago, it was a $2 trillion package, just under 10% of the regular GDP in our country. The package was designed to be robust because the idea that this is a bridge that can help us avoid a prolonged recession and downturn, and allows us to begin regular commerce once normal commerce can begin. So let's talk about a number of the major provisions for employers. I've broken them down into provisions available to all employers, and then the small businesses, the self-employed, independent contractors, and nonprofits. So we'll start with one of the provisions that's available to all employers, and it's the employee retention credit. This is a late add to the bill, so earlier drafts did not include this. There has not really been a lot of attention paid to it, so I wanted to bring it to your attention. The retention credit generally applies to all employers. We're talking about businesses, also nonprofits, for example, who are fully or partially shut down as a result of the coronavirus, or who've had a 50% drop in their gross receipts in a quarter, and they're eligible for this until their gross receipts get back up to 80% of their prior year's amount. The way to think about this is that this is designed to help employers who have shut down or lost revenue, but who continue to pay their employees. So the tax credit is it's a $5,000 tax credit per employer. A long way of reading it is it's 50% of the wages paid by the employer up to $10,000 per employee. So a $5,000 per employee tax credit. There are special rules for employers with more than 100 employees and employers with less than 100 employees. So if you have more than 100 employees, the benefit only applies to employers who you are paying. Oh, sorry about that. Who you are paying, but not providing services. So a way of thinking about this is if your business is shut down, you've had a drop in revenue, your employee is not working and they're not teleworking, but you continue to pay them. You can access this credit as a benefit in recognition of the fact that you continue to pay them. If you have 100 employees or less, the requirement that they not be providing services does not apply. It's available to all employees you pay during an eligible period. That eligible period, again, is when you're shut down or you've had a quarter with this drop of gross receipts relative to a prior year. So importantly, if you receive the Paycheck Protection Program, which would be great because it can be converted into a grant, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of this employee retention credit. We obviously know that a lot of employers are having a lot of cash flow problems right now, so you can request an advance on this credit. On April 7th, the Treasury issued guidance to request a form from the IRS called Form 7200, Advance of the Employer Credits Due to COVID-19. This will allow employers to get an advance of the payment of the credit that they deserved, and you can find this on the IRS website for that Form 7200. Okay, so the attention that's gotten the most amount of the provision that's gotten the most amount of attention that helps small businesses, the self-employed, and nonprofits is the Paycheck Protection Program. I'd like to go over in the event that someone applied for and received the loan, or if you wanted to continue to apply today. So the way that the bill was originally laid out, it laid out $349 billion in loans for small businesses. It's generally defined as employers with less than 500 employees, 501c3s, self-employed, sole proprietors, independent contractors. Last week, or a few weeks ago, the program was tapped out and went on hold. 1.6 million approved loans by over 500,000 lenders were approved. But you're encouraged to keep applying for the loan as it's received more funding that I'll get into. So if your business is generally qualified for an SBA program, you would qualify under this program. In addition to that, some employers and some businesses who would not qualify have been added to that list. And again, that's independent contractors and nonprofits. It also includes restaurants and hotel folks who would otherwise be ineligible because if you add up their locations, they have more than 500 employees. So don't automatically assume because you're not eligible for regular SBA program that you would not be eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. How much you can borrow? You can borrow up to 2.5 months of your average payroll expenses. There's a formula to calculate average monthly payroll. And once it's calculated, you can multiply it by 2.5, except that your loan cannot exceed $10 million. Lenders that participated and are continuing to participate in this are the national and local lenders that are already SBA 7(a) lenders, and all FDIC-backed banks and credit unions are also eligible and were eligible back when this originally came out. So there's very little requirements as far as underwriting these loans. There are no collaterals required. There's no personal guarantee required. There's a really unique feature of these loans that they can convert into grants based off what the borrower spends money on. So the way that the bill is laid out, it looks at 8 weeks of your expenses at the date of the origination of the loan, meaning that you have received the loan, not after you are approved. And you'll get to tally up everything that you spent on payroll, you spent on rent for business, interest and mortgages tied to business, and what you spent on utilities. And you can get dollar for dollar forgiveness of your loan amount up to that amount. And of course, your forgiveness cannot exceed the amount that you had actually borrowed. A couple of conditions though. If your loan forgiveness would be reduced proportionately if you reduce the number of full-time employees that you had relative to a benchmark period. That benchmark period is either the year before or the first 2 months of this year. The loan forgiveness is also reduced if you reduce wages for employees making less than $100,000 by more than 25%. And that's really good note about wages above $100,000. In your calculation of payroll expenses, you get to count the first $100,000 that you paid an employee, but nothing beyond that. This is because this package is designed really for middle income earners. Employers can also avoid a reduction in their forgiveness if they bring employees back that they had laid off and restored their wages, generally within 30 days, and maintain those employees and their wages through June 30th. So a way to think about this is what the government is incentivizing, that it wants to give money through small business, money to keep paying their employees. We're getting asked often, what if the business shut down or you happen to be in an area where Governor Whitmer says essential businesses can't open. That doesn't matter for this purpose. What the loan looks at is after taking the loan, were you still paying your employees? Okay, so the Paycheck Protection Program, as of last Friday, I kind of alluded to, there was about 1.7 million loans approved by the SBA. It's clear that over 500,000 lenders were participating. 74% of the loans were under $150,000, and the loan amount is $206,000. As I'm sure everyone had heard, on Friday, President Trump signed a nearly $500 billion interim coronavirus bill that includes additional money for the small business program, as well as money for funding hospitals and business or testing. So roughly $2.7 trillion since the CARES Act has been allocated as it was over 4 weeks ago. So the bill was passed the Senate on Friday earlier last week by a voice vote, and then by the House on Thursday by 388 to 5 bipartisan vote. So the bill includes $320 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program. The program, as I said, ran quickly out of money because of high demand and provides, this is the forgivable loans to small businesses. We do expect that 320 will be used pretty quickly. Additionally, about $60 billion of additional PPP funding was set aside for businesses that have established banking relationships, such as rural and minority-owned companies. Expanding access to the aid was a priority for Democrats who were worried that some businesses were being shut out. The bill also provides $60 billion in loans and grants for the economic injury disaster loans, which we'll get into here a little bit. That had been exhausted, $75 billion for hospitals, $25 billion more for coronavirus. But what the bill did not include was additional funding for states and local governments that the Democrats had sought. So although the bill totals nearly $500 billion, both parties have really come together in referring to this as interim legislation to bridge the gap between the $2.2 trillion in the CARES Act and the next round, phase 4, which the Senate comes back into town next week. The House will come back after the shelter-at-home restriction is lifted for those in D.C. So you can learn more about the Paycheck Protection Program. We created a 4-step guide to help you apply for one of these loans. It goes through in detail who's eligible, how you calculate your average monthly payroll cost, what your lender might be looking for when you show up to apply for a loan, and in addition, how your loan forgiveness can be calculated. It was such an effective guide that the SBA is actually using it in their social media posts, suggesting those considering applying for a loan, look at the guide. All right, another provision that benefits small businesses, the self-employed, independent contractors, and nonprofits are the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loans, known as EIDL loans, as I kind of alluded to. They've been around for a long time. If you might have been affected by, let's say, a tornado or a flood, for example, you might have applied and received an EIDL loan. So who is eligible? It'd be small businesses and nonprofits, including faith-based, and no restrictions here on the types of nonprofits. It's really any entity here that is fewer than 500 employees, along with sole proprietors and independent contractors. So the way that the bill had laid it out is that this is an actual loan, not a loan in general that can convert into a grant. It was laid out that you could borrow up to $2 million in working capital that's repaid over 30 years. And you can see the low interest rates there. However, much like the Paycheck Protection Program, there was an abundance of small businesses applying for this loan, and so that $2 million wasn't looking as lucrative toward the end, and was looking towards a range of $15,000 to $25,000. We'll see how, with it having an additional $60 billion injected into it, how that number changes. So if you get this loan, payments are deferred for a year. You don't have to immediately start paying on this loan. They made it easier for individuals to apply. Your loan is going to be based on your credit scores. You don't have to immediately start producing tax returns. You can get up to $200,000 without personal guarantee, and no collateral is required for $25,000 or less. Beyond that, there is a general security interest, or sometimes it's secured with real estate, but they're trying to move away from that in this particular instance. An important feature that's brand new as a result of the CARES Act is that if you're applying for the EIDL loan, one of these injury disaster loans, you can request that you be provided an emergency grant, which the bill had laid out was supposed to be provided within 3 days of up to $10,000. That 3 days was very optimistic, and it was looking to be more like 3 to 4 to 5, 6 weeks. And what the bill details what you may use the grant for, but there is no requirement. The $10,000 grant doesn't have to be repaid even if you're denied the loan. So if you apply for this EIDL loan and you request an emergency grant and you receive it and then you're denied the loan, you still will not have to pay back the up to $10,000. This essentially was an emergency grant for small businesses. There are some other important interactions with the Paycheck Protection Program. They've been both refunded here. For example, if you end up with both, you probably would have ended up with both either because you applied for one or the other. And you can roll them together, but you can't get double forgiveness for the $10,000 grant. That would come off your forgiveness under the Paycheck Protection Program. There are also some requirements with respect to the Paycheck Protection Program that you can't double dip. So in other words, if you take out 2 loans, you cannot use both to pay the same bills. So if you're thinking about for one or the other, if you applied for one and might want to get the other, you should think about those restrictions. Also, don't assume that you can do all these programs and stack them up. What they essentially did was make the Paycheck Protection Program the most favorable and then tacked on other programs that don't avail themselves to the Paycheck Protection Program, and that includes this EIDL loan. So you don't apply for this one going to your local bank like PPP. This one you go to the SBA's website at sba.gov. This is the one where other chambers and other 501c6s can apply for. Forgot to mention also that chambers can also receive the employee retention credit, but they have to be substantially shut down or a reduction in revenue relative to a prior year's period. So you want to think about that with your folks that do your taxes. Okay. So with respect to small business, there's some provisions that we've received a lot of questions about that don't come from the CARES Act. They come from the Families First Act, which is the prior bill called the Phase 2 bill. But the Phase 2 bill included a requirement that employers with less than 500 employees provide paid sick leave, 10 days of paid sick leave to their employees if it's related to the coronavirus. Sick leave is taken when you're ill, when you're quarantined, when you take care of a family member who's quarantined, or if you're taking care of a child because of school or daycare closures, as we've seen. So leave here is paid at your regular rate of a maximum of $511 per day, unless you're taking care of a family member. Then it's 2/3 the regular rate with a maximum of $200 per day. Importantly, the federal government will reimburse the employer 100% of these costs of the daily maximum that you pay your employees. And this is a refundable tax credit. And understanding that businesses have liquidity problems as well, the Treasury Department is taking steps to allow businesses to request in advance on that refundable credit, so you have the resources to pay employees who are taking sick leave. This is also in addition to what an employer already provides, including to what an employer must provide pursuant to state or local law. There's a lot of talk about businesses with fewer than 50 employees being exempt. The law does provide that an employer may be exempt, but they can only be exempt with respect to leave that's tied to taking care of a child whose core daycare is closed, or to the extent that if providing the leave threatens the viability of a business. So if you think this applies to you, you should check out the Department of Labor's guidelines that they're posting on their website, where they explain this further at labor.gov. Finally, paid sick leave is generally not available for an employee where they can telework. That only applies if the employee is taking care of a child, and they can also telework by staggering or changing their hours. Okay, kind of in the last portion here of the first. So the bill will also include paid family leave, or FMLA. For those not familiar, this is the Family Medical Leave Act. It's a law that generally allows for 12 weeks of unpaid leave. What the Phase 2 bill did say is that employers with less than 500 employees They are required to provide 10 weeks of paid family leave if the employee needs to take care of a child due to a school or child care closure caused by the coronavirus, as we're seeing. That is the only reason for extended leave in this sense. So when you think about the interaction between this and sick leave, an employee would probably have taken sick leave first and then would be eligible for 10 weeks of paid leave. So here again, paid leave is taking at 2/3 the regular rate with a maximum of $200 per day, $10,000 in the aggregate. In addition to what you already provide, again, under state and local law. And again, this one is also fully reimbursed in the same way by the federal government, 100%. There are some similar exemptions for employers with less than 50 employees, same as paid sick leave. And again, here, this is not available if an employee can telework. So just briefly, a couple of options that we have here for the Chamber has a lot of resources, including bill summaries, especially as we start going into phase 4. And then in particular with CO, which is our Chamber program that focuses on small businesses that have several tips and guides and other things that are available for small businesses. And again, our PPP guide is at uschamber.com/SB-loans. And with that, Kirsty, I'll kick it back to you for any questions, or Molly, that perhaps came from the field.
Yeah, definitely. We do have a few that came in. Our first question here has two parts to it. So the first part is, has the SBA released any further guidance concerning the forgiveness of the PPP loan, specifically if the expenses must be incurred and paid within the 8 weeks following the loan?
Could you repeat the last part of it?
Yeah, so specifically, if the expenses must be incurred and paid within the 8 weeks following the loan.
So from my understanding, and I would have to follow up, that it's everything that's incurred once you receive the loan. Once the loan is deposited into your account, everything that you start tallying up from that moment forward for those 8 weeks is what is included in the program.
Okay, and the second part of that question was also, has any guidelines been given regarding companies that have a high turnover rate? Currently, companies must rehire the same employees as the look-back period to be fully forgiven for wages paid.
They haven't released any additional guidance since their guidance on the program was put out a couple of weeks ago. I have not seen any new guidance since the bill or the funding was repurposed this past Friday, but I'll have to keep my eye out for that.
Okay, another question was, is it confirmed that the updates for the PPP will allow extra allowance for seasonal businesses changing the 12-week period from an estimation of February through June 2019 to May to September of 2019?
Again, I haven't seen any new guidance released as a result of more money being put into the program. So I'm assuming it took them a number of days in order to get guidance out of the last money put in. I would assume that it's going to take at least a couple more days before guidance is released again.
Okay, another question is, we are hearing that only 30 billion PPP will go to small banks and 10 billion assets or less. Estimates are it will run out in 48 hours, leaving rural community companies without. Is that a fact?
So regardless of how much money is set aside, we're expecting that the funds will be exhausted within 40 days. But that it's true that there is money set aside for rural communities. And that's when Congress, at least when the Senate returns next week, that we're going to be fighting for again for the program to be replenished.
Perfect. What program with a small chamber 501c6 with 2 employees, what could they qualify for?
Yeah, that's one of those questions that I wish I had an answer for, or at least a good answer to. As far as I know, at this point in time, there isn't any eligible program. I mean, there might be a lot of private, but there aren't any public programs that I know of so far.
Okay. The next question is, our payroll company only shows a partial credit for repayment for the new leave of employees that qualify for it. Do you know how we get paid back properly for the payment to the employees?
Yes, so if you go to the IRS website, there is a Form 7200 that you can request to fill out. It's Form 7200, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, related to COVID. That you can submit to the IRS in order to get an advance of that credit.
Has the PPP provided guidance on what the reporting will be required? On what reporting will be required?
Yes, and it's clearly laid out on our guide of what is required. Again, that's at, I don't know them all off the top of my head, but at uschamber.com/SB loans.
Okay. I just received a confirmation number when I applied for the EIDL. Where can I go to check the status of my EIDL application?
So I believe that if you go to sba.gov with your confirmation number and your information, you're allowed to create an account. And in doing so, that's where you'd be able to check your the status of your application.
Okay, we'll take a few more here. This one says, to be clear, the EIDL and PPP are independent from each other, correct? Could you apply for both?
Correct, you could. So they are separate from each other. You just cannot be paying the same sort of what you'd be spending money on. It's more suggested that you use PPP to use with your payroll as 75% of whatever you borrowed. That ultimately can be burdened to a grant has to go toward payroll. And then let's say, for example, you could use the rest in utilities or rent or other sort of capital that you need to keep with your business.
Will forgiveness of PPP loan count as taxable income?
I believe that it does.
Okay. I have heard that the $10,000 advance under the EIDL loan is limited to $1,000 per employee. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Does the employer have to pay out the full 10 weeks of FMLA before layoff?
That I'm not sure off the top of my head. If you wouldn't mind reaching out to Kirsty or Molly, I'd be happy to reach back, follow back with you on that question.
Okay, and then the last question, I guess it's not a question. They are eligible for the EIDL as a C6. We got ours already. So that someone was just saying that they already got theirs.
Oh, that's great. Good.
Perfect. And yes, as Ryan stated, anything that we're not able to answer at this time, please feel free to follow up with Kirsty and I directly. We will definitely make sure we get you any answers we're not able to get currently in this webinar. So for now, Ryan, I will turn it back over to you.
Sure, and then any lingering questions we can come back to at the end here.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so kind of in the next part here is, our national return to work plan that we put out about 2 weeks ago. And, with asking what will return to work look like? Obviously, that's a question weighing heavily in the minds of government leaders, public health officials, employers, and their employees, but most importantly, the American people and their families. And answering what that question of what return to work look like cannot be answered really in one question, let alone has one answer. It's becoming more and more abundantly clear that we will not be picking up anywhere close to where we had left off before this virus began. Instead, returning to work is obviously going to be gradual and phased in. We're seeing different governors put out different plans, and factors will be based on location, sector, business type, or size, the health of workers. Especially if you read or saw about President Trump's Opening Up America Again plan, that included 3 different phases, but each state is going to take their own approach. And it will obviously continue to require social distancing and the use of personal protective equipment such as masks. Okay, so To help business and government anticipate the challenges we may face, the U.S. Chamber has begun to explore and catalog some major implications of returning to work in this environment, ranging from workplace safety and employee rights to liability concerns and continued revenue disruption. So some of our initial thoughts are kind of broken down into these 3 bullet points: essential services and resources, resolution of regulatory and legal liability issues, and support for business and individuals, we kind of just were alluding to and we're going to continue to push for. So what do essential services and resources look like? Well, first is general health screening. The CDC has recommended that employers screen some exposed employees for temperature, ideally before entering a facility or business. This recommendation is expanded to cover all employers, all employees, and potential customers. Employers have to acquire temperature checking equipment to develop a screen and process how to screen individuals. So, big question is how do they pay for it? And there's also other general health screening concerns, such as use of other sorts of equipment. Next is COVID-19 testing. Most employers are not well positioned to administer these tests. So they must be widely accessible from third-party providers, perhaps a new industry in this country. Plus, more than likely, they'll have to be frequent in testing. Frequent testing obviously could be very costly. So again, here is, how is it determined who will endure those costs? All right, so PPE, or personal protective equipment. Public health professionals recommend widespread use of PPE, such as masks. It will require clarity as to what is needed and who is responsible for providing such equipment, especially if shortages persist, as we've seen with masks. Next is transportation. Approximately 8 million Americans rely on public transportation to get to and from work each day. Public transportation is most efficient when it maximizes how many it can service, and it needs to be avoided to preserve social distancing. Imagine buses full of people. That really cannot exist in this day and age. So while staggering work times, such as employees A starting at 7 a.m., employees B starting at 8 a.m., and employees C starting at 9 a.m., et cetera, can help spread out the rush hour. But transit systems will likely require some form of financial assistance to support a safe return to work. And lastly here, and perhaps most important, is childcare. In order to allow other parents to return to work, children will need childcare. Childcare providers will likely need to operate at suboptimal financial conditions, below previous capacity levels, as not all employees will return to work at once. And with increased costs, such as to maintain social distancing and accommodate staggered work times, child care providers will likely require some form of temporary financial assistance in recognition that they will need to operate at a loss in order to allow their parents to return to work. Again, where is this funding going to come from? Local, state, or federal? Okay, so a reopening plan that's medically based and relies on social distancing and other best practices for public health may raise significant regulatory and legal liability risks. These are in addition to the numerous lawsuits already filed as a result of COVID-19, and litigation risk will become worsened during a reopening. First off, probably the most obvious is health privacy. Maximizing an individual's health privacy could conflict with the potential reopening requirements that employers need to verify an employee's COVID-19 status and or other vulnerabilities due to other health conditions. How is that going to look? Additionally, there's going to be discrimination claims. For example, employers who conduct medically based or risk-based reopening using factors such as age or underlying health conditions may face liability under existing anti-discrimination rules, including the age discrimination in employment and the anti-discrimination provisions in the Americans with Disability Act. I'm sure most of us know the most vulnerable population are 65 and older, and how's that going to look? And we're telling them that they may not be able to return to work. Also, employers may face claims for adverse employment actions by employees who are delayed in returning to work or who feel that they are not being provided reasonable employment accommodations, as there's going to be a number of afraid employees out there. At the same time, employers could likewise face liability if they return at-risk employees to work too soon. So additionally, there will be safe workplace requirement changes. Biggest one probably is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or known as OSHA, requires employers to be responsible for ensuring availability of equipment like PPE and in training employees who use the equipment. This would not be possible if PPE becomes recommended in all workplaces. We're going to need to continue to support independent contractors. Businesses want to be able to provide the same type of workplace protections to independent contractors as they do for their employees. So how does that relationship look? Also, changes to employment practices. Employers could face liability for wage and hour issues. For example, are employees compensated while getting tested or passed through screening? There's going to be change to leave policy. There'll be travel restrictions, telework protocols, and workers' compensation. Also, employers could risk legal actions if they do not accommodate employees who either insist on returning to work even though they've not completed health screenings or are high risk, or who refuse to work and provide proper support for such refusal. Next up are all the liabilities. There are a number of exposure, product, and medical liabilities, but what I would like to focus on is exposure liability, which is perhaps the largest concern for overall business community. It has multiple types of claims that can be brought against the business that have been deemed or designated as essential, as large as well swaths of the remaining business community once the economy is reopened. The core component of claims in this category is that is a customer or an employee or patient or member of the public, et cetera, were they exposed to COVID-19 in the business facility or as a result to a business's particular action or failure to act. And then that claimant became sick. Legal theories underlying these claims may range from simple negligence to strict public nuisance, which the plaintiff's bar could try and pursue through contingency fee arrangements with cash-strapped state and municipalities. Though it seems more than likely that these claims would be very tough to prove, but how much that would waste employers' time in the courtroom. So next is customer communications. It's becoming more evident today that businesses are communicating with customers by reaching out via telephone or text messages, which could be critical, especially during this time of social distancing. But it's currently being threatened under litigation by the Telephone and Consumer Protection Act. And additionally, there's going to be issues with the False Claim Act, as I'm sure you could imagine. So we've seen the federal government take unprecedented steps to support employers and individuals during this current shutdown with all the money, as I said, has been spent with the $2.7 trillion with the CARES Act Plus. These programs will need to be modified and to some extent extended to assist those businesses and individuals who remain under distress during the phased or gradual reopening, especially as I believe someone here mentioned earlier about those in rural areas. Probably the most obvious one, though, is businesses dependent on high-density gatherings or travel. So entertainment venues like movie theaters, concert halls, restaurants, bars, companies that host meetings and events, and many other businesses are only profitable when they achieve the type of occupancy that density that's not possible during social distancing. In addition, many businesses rely on business, trade show, and personal travel that might be greatly reduced based on social distancing guidance. Gradual or phased reopening that restricts the size of gatherings or limits travel may technically permit these businesses to reopen, but this will mean operating at a significant loss. During a period where occupancy and gatherings are numerically restricted, these sorts of businesses should be provided with a bridge of assistance to enable them to remain viable. Next, there's going to be a delay in individuals returning to work. So until there's a widely available vaccine, or at the very least a widely available effective treatment for those who fall ill, not everyone will resume normal work activities. High-risk populations will need to engage in social distancing or even remain at home entirely. Individuals, including independent contractors who must stay home because of their risk profile, will need ongoing financial support if they cannot work remotely. This may require an extension of regular unemployment insurance or the creation of perhaps a new high-risk unemployment insurance system. And finally, it should remain the case that businesses remain operating optimally remotely should continue to do so if possible. So kind of in the last part here where I'm looking for, folks that are participating, their input, what additional services do you see necessary to support during a phased reopening? What additional resources do you anticipate needing to operate during a phased reopening? What additional guidance, including specific regulatory guidance from the federal government, would be beneficial during this time? What additional legal liability issues would you be concerned about during a phased reopening? Do you anticipate your business needing additional financial support to bridge a phased reopening? So what would that take? How has your business perhaps changed how you operate as a result of COVID-19? And what sort of changes would you anticipate after the pandemic? Have you benefited from any support from the federal government, including the Paycheck protection program? What sort of feedback would you give on the federal response? What sort of new support would you imagine needing going forward? And then, restoring the economy will be a matter of private sector employers being able to resume activity. So what other roles could the private sector be playing? What hindrances do you see in the way of these efforts? And then any sort of additional questions that we perhaps have forgotten to ask. If you have any more feedback or questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Return to Work at the U.S. Chamber. But in the meantime, Kirsty and Molly, I will kick it back to you for any additional questions from the earlier part of the program or anything in the latter half.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. We do have a few questions that came in. So the first question is someone who owns a rental property, a cabin in Manistee. They don't have any employees and it is an LLC. So they are wondering if there are any programs that could help with their lost rental income.
It's a good question. I know that there is different ways for LLCs. I believe they can qualify under the Paycheck Protection Program. So you would be able to at least put some up to 25% of your rental with that. And so that's something that I would look into with your local financial bank to see if you could qualify for that.
Perfect. With the PPP, it mentioned that within 30 days, employees have to return to work and be there through June 30th. Is that 30 from the loan origination?
Yes, it's from the loan origination.
Perfect. What will event planning look like? Will events be allowed in 2021?
Well, I'm an optimist in thinking that I think that events in some way, shape, or form will be allowed in 2021. If you look at the different phases through which kind of the president had put out, which I'm assuming will be kind of at least like the national guidelines, as long as the CDC guidelines are permitted, that would be the case. I just can't say for sure, just because 2 months ago I didn't envision sitting here presenting on this, hoping to rather be with you, and who knows what the next 2 months will look like. I'm optimistic though, and to believe that events will happen next year.
Perfect. This is a question that we've actually been getting a lot of, and it's concerns over recall of employees where they make more through unemployment than they are with their normal wages. So the question was, do you see the 600 federal bump being extended past July?
From a personal matter, the amount of kind of webinars and stuff that I've heard, this is one of the biggest questions that we're getting, and it seems like the federal government is being widely panned for this decision. I would find it very difficult for them to include the full $600, perhaps it's reduced to $250 or something like that, just because we're seeing this awkward relationship between the employer and prospective employee. Because in those cases, the employer should really be going to their state government and suggesting fraud is being committed. However, that's really ruining the relationship with your respective employee. And how do you go about, bringing back a different employee to replace that person?
Perfect. And then the next question is, someone applied for the EIDL and they did not receive it because the money was gone. So at this point, are they able to reapply?
Did you apply before March 31st or after March 31st?
Let's see if this person sends it in. She did not specify in her question.
I would, let's just take for example that she applied before or after March 31st. She would not need to reapply. She would remain in queue. So she would not need to reapply.
Okay, she did say it was before.
If she applied for before, then she would probably want to consider reapplying in order to get that emergency grant.
Perfect. Sounds good. It looks like this is all the questions we had at the time. Let me just make sure all the other areas are good. Not sure this is a question. Daycare is a real issue in our rural area. With being an essential business, at what point with businesses opening back up, at what point is an employer able to go ahead and fill that position?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, daycare is a real issue in our rural area. With being an essential business, at what point with businesses opening back up, at what point is an employer able to go ahead and fill that position?
That would really depend on state by state. So depending on how Governor Whitmer kind of plays through this, would depend on that. That wouldn't happen from the federal government. So you would have to continue to see guidance and what the governor and her team puts out as far as reopening and bringing back employees or replacing them.
And Ryan, this is Kirsty Seeloff. That person can go ahead and email me. It sounds like they have a question about an essential business filling an essential business spot. So they can go ahead and reach out to me, and I'm happy to discuss further and take a look at your situation.
Thanks, Kirsty. Another question we just had, I think it's more for clarification. Will events, do you know, will they be permitted in 2020, or do you not see that happening again until 2021?
Yeah, I don't want to give people false hope or the wrong sort of speculation. I'm led to believe that at some point this year that there will be, that restaurants will reopen, but it won't be at full capacity. I think it's going to be really very difficult for events. It's kind of the guidance was when this all began of more than 250 people. But you never know. As I had said 2 months ago, we had no idea you'd be sitting in this situation. And 2 months from now, who knows with regard to like how treatment looks, how the summer looks with regard to this. I just don't want to give false hope.
And Ryan, from the state perspective, this is Kirsty Seeloff. The Northern Michigan Chamber Alliance and Traverse Connect, we are closely monitoring the governor's plans for reopening. And just yesterday, she gave some insight into her phased approach that she's looking at. So we will continue to monitor that and keep our businesses informed.
I'm glad that y'all got your voting back.
Us too. People here are very happy. I don't see any other questions coming in at this time. However, if anyone does have any additional questions, like we said earlier, you are more than welcome to send either myself or Kirsty an email. We'd be more than happy to get those answered for you. Or if you have any clarifying questions, we can definitely get those answered for you as well. Ryan, we just want to thank you again so much for being here with us today, for providing all this wonderful information and for answering everyone's questions. It was extremely helpful and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I would just say what to look forward to from here is what the CDC does with regard to these guidances, hoping that they're not regulated, but they're more issued as guidances for businesses. That'll be critical in getting business open and going again, as opposed to more of a backlog. And then that's what the Phase 4 bill is going to look like, is that conversations are happening behind the screens right now, but hopefully there'll be a little more in public next week when the Senate returns. And then hopefully I can give you an update with regard to that as well.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again. I hope everyone has a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care.